What holds back most indie game developers from successfully finishing their game isn't lack of motivation, isn't getting lost in your own code after 6 months, and it isn't that marketing is too scary. All of those things stem from the same fundamental problem, which is that your game idea makes all those things more difficult than they need to be. But the good news is that all you need to do to fix this is to apply 3 simple tweaks to your idea so that you don't end up with an overscoped nightmare, but actually get your game done and go through a successful launch. In case you don't know me, I'm Anjay. I help indie game developers get their ideas on the right track because I think a lot of people overlook just how important that fundamental core idea really is. So we're going to be looking at some game ideas that some viewers have sent me and determine whether or not they're viable by testing them against 3 keys and applying the tweaks necessary to get the idea to the finish line. If you'd like to submit a game idea for a critique, just shoot me an email with the subject line "critique my idea." You can find my email on my channel's about page. The first game comes from Isaac, and it's a World War II RTS game. Let's start by covering what's good about this idea. First of all, the game has a clear, strong fantasy, which is actually key number 1. The fantasy of your game is the answer to the question, what do you play as? Or also, what do you do in this game? It essentially has to be something that you'd want to be or want to try without having to take a risk or make a commitment. So for example, being an army general, that could be interesting as long as you don't have to actually go to real life war and risk your life. But also even something like being a garbage man could be an interesting fantasy if you were just going to try it out for like a day without having to endure the stink and deal with the weather and switch to doing something else the next day. So clearly the premise of the game being a World War II army general is an interesting fantasy. The other good thing he's done is he's prototyped the art using an AI generated image, and it's really hard to look at your own artwork if you're not super skilled in art and determine whether or not it's good. So having a sort of target image to base your art off of is really going to help you nail the art direction. It's essentially like having concept art, but indie game developers don't really have the resources to pay concept artists, so using AI to just do tests like this makes perfect sense. Now let's talk about the issues, which have to do with our other 2 keys, which are genre and scope. First of all, this game is an RTS, which is just not one of the genres that is considered to do that well on Steam. However, there is a very similar genre called the base builder tower defense that does seem to do well. For example, Thronefall is a game like that. Here's the problem, which ties into key number 3, which is scope. Even those games, even the base builder tower defense, it takes a really long time to build. And also the way that this game is kind of set up right now, the scope is kind of all over the place. You have all these different classes and these different actions different units can take, and a lot of this is kind of redundant. For example, why can I go into artifacts as the general? That doesn't seem like an obvious part of what it means to be a general. You have all these different structures like trenches and helipads, and if those have meaningful mechanics associated with them, then you have to implement all of that. You're gonna have to make sure all of this is well balanced and well designed, and that's really hard. This game will take you 5 years to make, and you're gonna want to quit after about 6 months. Before we continue, I'd like to thank our sponsor, LucidLink. LucidLink is a cloud storage and file sharing platform perfect for indie game developers working either alone or in a team. The way LucidLink works is that even though it is a remote storage system, it acts as a local drive, meaning when you stream your files through LucidLink, you don't actually need to download any of the files or update anything to see the changes locally. When you make changes to your files stored in your LucidLink workspace, those changes occur in real time. As someone who travels a lot, this is perfect because since I can't bring my desktop with me, instead of copying my game projects to a flash drive, I can upload them to LucidLink and work on my game from my laptop or any other remote device without even needing to download the game files to that device. If you don't have multiple devices and work alone, LucidLink is also a great way to store backups of your game files externally instead of taking up additional space on your hard drive. If you want to work on the files without an internet connection, you can do that too by simply pinning those files and you'll always have access to them. Check out LucidLink in the description, and a huge thanks to LucidLink for sponsoring this video. So how do we make sure that our scope is tight enough? What is the objective metric by which we can determine whether or not our scope is as big as it needs to be? Well, the best way that I can think of personally would just be to ask which features apply directly to your fantasy. What does a general do? He commands an army. That's it. He doesn't examine buildings, he doesn't repair structures, but that does kind of shed light on the problem, doesn't it? Commanding an army means you're gonna have units that do a lot of different things. In order for commanding an army to be meaningful, the army has to be somewhat varied and engage in a variety of different challenges. So what does that tell us? Well, it turns out that commanding an army might be a bit too big of a core fantasy for an indie game. So fantasy and scope are very much related. If your core fantasy can't be described as one single action, then it's probably a little bit too big. But scope isn't the only problem with a fantasy like this. It's also not unique. There's so many RTS games about commanding an army, and in this case, unfortunately, the truth is that there are always going to be better games than yours. So to solve both of these problems, to create a more narrow scoped fantasy and to make sure that your game can be the best version of representing that core fantasy is we need to come up with a more specific fantasy. In the design doc that you shared with me, you can essentially build 20 different games out of this with far more unique core fantasies. You could make an entire game just about repairing a howitzer. This would also change the game from an RTS into more of a job simulator, and those are really good for Steam. Or you could just be the radio operator. That in itself could create a really interesting game with very unique mechanics. Like if you have to deal with the communications problems or deal with the radio or figure out like what you're listening to, what you're hearing, if there's too much static or something like that. Obviously this is going to be very different from the game that you've come up with, but it's going to be a lot more unique. If you can narrow down which fantasy really appeals to you the most in the game that you've come up with, that's going to help you a lot to narrow down your scope. So good luck to you, Isaac. Let me know if this helped, and best of luck with your game. The next game on our list is called Tethered Spirits. Now, this game suffers from a very different problem than Isaac's game. Tethered Spirits is about a guy who's trapped in a mountain and has this spirit that is connected to him, and they're sort of at odds, but they both want to escape. That's potentially an interesting narrative, but the problem is there is no clear fantasy here. Let's break down the components. You've got climbing a mountain, interacting with the spirit world, and breaking out of a prison. Each of those as an individual core fantasy comes with its own expectations. Like we discussed with Isaac's game, getting super specific about your fantasy allows you to be unique and helps keep your scope simple. Adding to your fantasy doesn't make it more unique, it just makes it more confusing. Removing stuff from the fantasy and really narrowing down is what makes it unique. Okay, so before doing anything else with this idea, make sure you figure out what you really want the fantasy of the game to be. Also, your art style is going to need some work. I recommend doing what Isaac did actually and generating some prototypes with AI. It's going to help you to come up with a good color palette and a good art style. If you don't want to do that, then you're going to have to learn about color theory and composition and things like that, so whichever one of the two you think is more reasonable. And by the way, if you want a more detailed understanding of how you can actually arrive at a core fantasy that appeals to you, and how to figure out how to apply the right genre to that fantasy, I have a whole workshop dedicated just to coming up with those elements of your game idea. It's very introspective and really helps you to come up with the heart of what your game is, and it really helped Shockwave to come up with just that for his games. So be sure to check that out, link in the description. Now let's continue with our third game. Alright, the next game idea comes from a friend of the channel, John. He's commented here and there, and we've had some good discussions with some disagreements about methodology, but always very interesting and positive discussions. So I'm going to do my best to help John out. From his email, he sounds very passionate about his game, like all of us are in the first few months. He's been working on it for 6 months, but feels it will only be playable in 3 months. Here's what he said. Currently, although you can fly the ship and interact with the base UI, there are still too many parts missing. So that's what John said he's built in 6 months. So it's a spaceship game. However, he's also said at the end of the year, I won't have pirates attacking you, or factions, or a huge variety of ships and components, but you will be able to fly your ship, customize it with a small selection of parts, and deliver cargo to a few locations on the map. After that, it's just a matter of creating more locations, more ships, and ship parts, factions, and pirates, and so on. So John said he wants to create art for self-expression. I think anyone who wants to make games can really relate to that. I know I certainly can. But John also wants to make money off of his game. I want to be super practical with what I say. If you want to make money off your game, you have to answer some questions. How long is this game going to take to make? That's very important. That tells you how much money you need to make. For 6 months, John was able to implement flying the ship and the base UI, but he doesn't consider that playable. If the game isn't playable after 6 months, I don't think it's going to be playable in another 3, and I don't think you'll be able to implement everything you said you want to by December. My estimate would be more like at the very least another 6 to 8 months. But then other than those core features, you also said it's just a matter of creating more locations and so on. So what we call more locations and factions is content. Right? It's not the features that you're building, it's the sort of the story and the use of the assets that you're putting into the world. So for reference, this is essentially exactly what Skyrim modders do, right? They have the game engine, they have all the, you know, the houses and the assets and whatnot, or maybe they're creating their own 3D models, but they're putting that in the world. They have all the systems already in the creation kit, and they're now building out their quests, their locations, and so on. And a lot of these mods can take years to make. But the truth about content is that it's not the end of development, it's the bulk of development. It's a lot harder to create lots of content for your game than to create the core features of the gameplay mechanics. So my estimate is that it'll take you at the very least 2 years to create the content. Of course, it depends on how big you want the game to be, but if you want the game to be sufficiently big for Steam players to take an interest in it, you're gonna need to probably spend at least 2 years making that content. So the question I think that you should ask yourself is, if you want to make art for self-expression, but you also want to make money, is this work of art really worth worth spending 3 years on? How much do you deserve to get paid for those 3 years of work? I would say whatever a comfortable 3-year salary would be, or at the very least enough money to have a salary as you build your second game. So if you want to take 1 year to make your second game, then fine, let's say that the bare minimum that you need is 1 year's salary, whatever you think is acceptable for that. But okay, so let's say in an ideal world you actually make that happen, you actually finish this game in 3 years. Will your motivation last for 3 years? In a year from now, will you look back and think, that was great, that was a good use of my time, or will you think, I wish I spent more time with my family? Is this game really the work of art I should be pouring my heart and my soul into? From an indie game mechanics perspective, there's nothing terribly unique about the game that you've described. You're just delivering cargo in space and dealing with space pirates. So I'm struggling to see the value of the self-expression, of devoting that much time to the self-expression, when there isn't really that much, substance to the idea that makes it seem worth it. You haven't told me about the story for the game, and that's fine, but if the story is what you're passionate about, because the mechanics aren't really terribly unique, and this is a story that you really need to tell, then there's nothing wrong with just writing a book. Writing a book is 100 times easier than making a game. You only have to be really good at writing instead of being really good at 3D modeling, art, programming, game design, polishing your main menus, your UI. And if making a game is what you want to make, well then, what is the game mechanic? What is the unique way to present the game that makes the game mechanic a self-expression of artwork? So from a pragmatic perspective, my advice is that this is not the game that you should be making. You should find out what the self-expression really is, what that really means to you in your art. If it ends up being a game after all, then you should be making a game in a genre that works well on Steam, spending 3 to 6 months on development, and being super disciplined, removing any obstacles in the game design that will prevent you from reaching that goal. I know this is all very harsh, but I really hope that this helps some of you out there. If you want to really narrow down what your game idea should be, and if you want to come up with a truly unique indie game idea that inspires you and that you can actually finish, check out that workshop below. Thank you so much for watching this, and God bless.